the next 30 minutes, you will, by the time you walk out of here, you'll understand the exciting science behind C15 or pentadecanoic acid, the first essential fatty acid to be discovered since omega-3 and omega-6, which was over 90 years ago. We'll talk about how it's 3 times the cellular benefits of omega-3. We're going to talk about the mounting science around C15, where it went head-to-head against rapamycin, metformin, and acarbose and showed that it has more benefits and closely follows rapamycin. It's what evolution has enabled C15 to be our longevity enabler for millions of years. Whoops, I have to behave, stay in the zone. And then third, we're going to talk about the urgency of C15. Our primary source of C15 is from whole fat dairy. What have we been doing over the last 40 years? Decreasing our intake of whole fat dairy. This has resulted in population-wide C15 nutritional deficiencies. Leading hypothesis, C15 deficiencies are actually accelerating aging rates, and NAFLD may be a C15 deficiency syndrome, like pirates and scurvy, right? Vitamin C and scurvy. So, you know, in those treasure hunting movies, right, there's always that moment where the bad guys have stolen the map and they're at the axe and they're digging for the coveted treasure. And then the good guys realize that the axe was actually in the wrong spot and that they, in fact, are standing in the exact right place, find the hidden treasure, and land the happy ending. Now, that's kind of what happened with us for the hunt for the holy grail of healthy aging, except that there are no bad guys, of course. Because while a lot of people were up at the top X of longevity scientists looking at short-lived species, right, mice, worms, and flies, to figure out what can help them live longer, we were fortuitously working with large-brain, long-lived mammals to understand and ask the question, how have millions of evolutionary years already allowed long-lived mammals to live longer than mice, worms, and flies in the first place? And shouldn't we be tapping into those mechanisms to help us live even longer and healthier? So the fun part of our adventure is that where our X was, where C15 pentadecanoic acid is emerging as the leading longevity molecule, prescription drug or nutrient, and it's a molecule that every mammal gets from birth. It's what we're supposed to have to live longer. And the importance of C15 was found, this is my favorite part, was from taking care of long-lived, large-brain, older dolphins at the Navy. So I'll go back on that one real quick. So yes, Navy dolphins. I am a veterinary epidemiologist, was working for the World Health Organization, was brought in by the Navy to help understand older dolphins because they get such good care at the Navy. They live more than 2 times longer than what dolphins in the wild. And what we found were that Navy dolphins age a lot like us. They develop high cholesterol, chronic inflammation, fatty liver disease, even the full suite of changes consistent with Alzheimer's. So what we did is we applied the advanced technology called metabolomics, and we looked at thousands of small molecules in their blood and their all-fish diet to figure out which small molecules predicted the healthiest aging dolphins. And we went in with a hypothesis that, of course, it was going to be omega-3s because all they eat are fish. And what we found, surprisingly, was that omega-3s had nothing to do with healthy aging in dolphins, and that, in fact, it was C15 was one of the top predictors of healthy aging. It ends up, all of this was being uncovered in the human world at the same time. So before we get into C15, let's talk a little bit about longevity, because we're going to be focusing on C15 as a geroprotector, right? Something that can improve our health span and our lifespan. So we've already doubled our lifespan over the last 120, 160 years. And so the question is, could we extend and double our lifespan again to live to 160 years old by the year 2180? Now, most longevity scientists say no, that's not going to happen. There's limits to how long we can live. And that's why a lot of focus has been on extending our health span, how long we live healthfully as long as possible. But because of our unique work with the Navy's dolphins, we've spent the last 10 years researching molecules that have the potential to do both, extend our health span and our lifespan. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to C15. such a simple molecule, 15 straight carbons, no double bonds. And its another name is pentadecanoic acid. Again, we published extensive work in 2020 in scientific reports describing how C15 meets the criteria of being an essential fatty acid, again, the first to be discovered since Mildred and George Burr in 1929 with omega-3 and omega-6. Then when we talk about essential fatty acids, these are fats, nutrients that we must have at certain levels in our body in order to maintain physiological health. If we don't have enough in our body, we literally start falling apart. So it's very rare to find an essential fatty acid. I'm sure there will be more coming down thanks to advanced technologies. And the important part is that our bodies don't make enough C15 on their own. There is some evidence that bacteria in our gut can use fiber and inulin to make C15, which helps explain the benefits in models of NAFLD. But overall, our body doesn't make enough C15 on its own, which means that we have to get enough C15, somewhere between 200 to 300 milligrams of C15 per day in order to meet our minimum requirements. So given that we had found that C15 was meeting the criteria of an essential fatty acid, we then tested it head-to-head against the purest, highest performing omega-3 with regard to heart health, and that was EPA. And the way we tested it was we used a panel called BioMap. Now, this is a well-used industry standard panel by pharmaceutical companies to be able to evaluate safety, efficacy of drugs, and benchmark it against others. BioMap has 12 human cell systems, primary human cell systems, that cover a variety of disease states, whether it's heart disease, autoimmune disease, fibrotic diseases, across the whole body. And it measures 148 different biomarkers, and it sees how well a compound does that at 4 different concentrations. So not only significant effect against a non-treated control system, but significant effect that's dose-dependent and better than what's currently best in class. And so what we found using this test was that a C15, pure C15, had 36 cellular benefits, many of them reducing pro-inflammatory cytokines, anti-fibrotic, we'll talk through anti-cancer properties, and that was 3 times more than omega-3, than EPA. So with that, with this study pointing that C15 may in fact be the essential fatty acid, just like the dolphins told us, we then moved into understanding C15's role with regard to longevity and our health span. And there's a really cool theory, which is called the cell membrane pacemaker theory of aging. This is from A.J. Holbert. And what he showed in his fascinating studies were that what could explain how a human and a dolphin lives longer than a mouse. And what he showed was that when you look at the cell membrane layer, the bilipid layer of the cell membrane, the stronger the fatty acids in the cell membrane, the longer a lifespan a mammal had. It's so simple, right? If we can protect our cells against lipid peroxidation longer, that allows that mammal to live longer. It's such a simple and elegant solution that evolution has played. So knowing that C15 is a stable, saturated fat with benefits, an odd chain saturated fat, then our question is, can increasing C15, can we take something that evolution is already using to help mammals live longer and push it even more to help increase our lifespan and health span? So in order to do that, we went through 4 must-haves of a geroprotector, right? So the first is that it has to reverse hallmarks of aging. We now know there are 12 hallmarks of aging, so it needs to reverse key hallmarks of aging as well as target the longevity pathway. Second is that there should be evidence that it can slow the rate at which we age. Third, that it can tangibly improve health. Who cares that it does something specifically to zombie cells and senescence if you actually don't see an improvement as physicians in your patients? And third, that it should delay the onset or reverse chronic conditions. On top of having to do all of these things, it also has to be something that your patients can take safely over long periods of time, right? And that's where a lot of things like rapamycin are still on the table, or we're not sure if they're going to stay on the table because of safety. So let's see how C15 does in these 4 longevity molecule must-haves. So there are 4 hallmarks of aging that C15 specifically goes after. That is cellular senescence, so our zombie cells, mitochondrial dysfunction, inflammaging, so chronic inflammation throughout the body, and impaired cellular signaling. Specifically, and again, everything we're sharing, I should mention, are all peer-reviewed studies. If you go to discoverc15.com, this is where all the studies on C15 are. So specifically, we know that C15 literally goes in, embeds itself into the cellular membrane, and it can strengthen cells by 80%. It improves mitochondrial function, so it has a rescue function for mitochondria that aren't working well, especially complex 1 that goes down with aging. It has a rescue function that pops itself into complex 2, gets the mitochondria back up and running again. It has over 18 anti-inflammatory activities of pro-inflammatory cytokines across multiple cell systems, especially those related to aging, and it helps balance 5 longevity signals. So if we talk specifically about which longevity signals, we are looking here at a very simplified schematic of the human longevity pathway, right? You do this thing here, you get longer life. So we know that AMPK activators and mTOR inhibitors are core mechanisms for longevity. Rapamycin, right, inhibits mTOR. Metformin activates AMPK. And acarbose, which is another leading longevity molecule, actually kind of cheats the system and kind of skips the cell-based stuff, and it prevents absorption of carbohydrates at the gut level. And so by doing so it's able to get through and to extend longevity. Now, when we look at C15, we now know that C15 activates AMPK, which is the heart of the longevity pathway, and it also inhibits mTOR. So by that, it kind of gets this 1-2 punch right in the heart of the longevity pathway. On top of that, we know that C15 also activates PPAR alpha delta and is also a JAK-STAT and HDAC6 inhibitor. All of a sudden, this becomes really real, right? C15, again, nature's using this very simple molecule to be pleiotropic, to do the things that long-lived mammals need to live longer. And when you put all of these mechanisms together, we should expect to see tangible changes that then are going to result in longer life. So check. That was the biggest one, by the way, the longest one, by the way. So is there evidence that C15 can slow aging rate? So to answer this one, we went back to the dolphins because we're able to answer the question that amazingly had not yet been answered, which is if you look at individuals in the same environment, in the same population, will there be individuals that age at different rates, right? You're controlling for all the other environmental components. And so we all know that and believe, right, that people age at different rates. That's independent more than just genetics, more than something blatant, like being here in Vegas this week. So the goal, right, to extend healthspan and lifespan is to slow the biological rate of aging, and by doing so, we can live longer and healthier. So what we were able to show in the dolphins was that once we found that dolphins confirmed that there were slower and faster aging dolphins, we're able to do that by confirming a marker of aging. So this is a great one to take notes on. Declining hemoglobin with age is a very effective biomarker of biological aging rate, not only in dolphins, but humans. And it makes sense, right? Because red blood cells reflect cellular health of the body. You're able to easily access it. And it inevitably ends in anemia of aging or anemia of chronic disease. So it's something that's clinically relevant that you care about, and also as a marker of aging rate. So what we're able to show in the dolphins was when we increased the C15 in their diet, hemoglobin levels reversed and went back up, and we were able not only to fix anemia in 100% of the dolphins, but we were also able to say, hey, there's evidence that's actually slowing the rate of aging by, again, stabilizing those cells. So third, is there evidence that it can tangibly improve health? And this is my favorite slide. So there's a lot of evidence. So knowing its mechanism of action lines up well with what we see in vivo and in cell-based studies, as well as human epidemiological studies. First, we talked about C15's broad anti-inflammatory role. which is going to be big, right, for taming aging-related diseases. It's an anti-fibrotic, so it directly goes after development of fibrosis. We've been able to show this in vivo in models of fatty liver disease. It also is an antioxidant, so we talked about how it is a saturated fat with no double bonds. So once it gets into the cell membrane, it helps make our cells particularly resistant against lipid peroxidation. And some of the most exciting studies that have come out in the last year are the anti-cancer properties of C15, groups showing that C15 is able to stop proliferation of over 6 different cancer cell types. It made gemcitabine work better in vivo models, and it even reversed tamoxifen resistance in breast cancer cells. So keep attention to that one. And then finally, it's also antimicrobial. So C15 directly inhibits growth of both pathogenic bacteria and fungi. In fact, it's used in some hospitals as a lining in equipment to prevent the growth of bacteria and fungi. So it's not surprising then that there are many epidemiological studies showing that people who have higher C15 have healthier blood values, right? Lower cholesterol and triglycerides, better insulin sensitivity, lower glucose, better blood pressure, lower weight, and lower inflammation. And a clinical trial just came out last week from Singapore showing that women who were overweight and had NAFLDs were placed on a hypocaloric diet between 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day. They then took those women and they put them on a Mediterranean diet with those same caloric restrictions. And then they took the third group where they had to do the first 2 plus add C15 supplementation for 12 weeks. And what that study, that controlled clinical trial showed was that C15 supplementation, on top of all the benefits that came with the first 2 groups, also had lower LDL cholesterol, had lower total body fat mass, and had increased growth of a bacterium called Bifidobacterium adolescentis, which is a critical bacteria in our gut that provides a lot of support. There's a summary of all of the wonderful things that this bacteria does. So it helps to kind of regulate our microbiome. So tangibly improving health, so the test that you should see in your patients. And then finally, does it delay chronic conditions or reverse? And we and others have been able to show that in vivo models, treatment with C15 can reverse disease processes. That aligns with meta-analyses, many large prospective cohort studies following thousands of people over decades, showing that if they have higher C15, they're at lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, multiple stages of heart disease, as well as different types of cancer, and in one study, Alzheimer's disease. So it's done pretty well, C15, for maybe a molecule you hadn't heard of, unless you had met us at a previous events. And it was hidden because C15 is a saturated fat. And we've all been told all saturated fats are bad, but when you go to discoverc15.com, you'll see there's all this literature. It was all there, that C15 as a trace odd-chain saturated fatty acid has these benefits. We kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, right, when we took all saturated fats away. So the reason why it's important talking about C15 today is given that our source of C15 is whole fat dairy, we've decreased our intake of whole fat dairy, and that has resulted in population-wide decreases in C15 levels. We now know, and there'll be studies coming out in early 2024, showing that there is a threshold, that we need C15 levels at about 5 micrograms per ml in order to have that baseline physiological health. In some instances, like cardiovascular benefits, it increases as you get above that amount. But what's critical is being able to get C15 back into people's lives, because as these levels have gone down, we certainly haven't gotten healthier, right? We've gotten sicker, and we have an easy way to help get our health back. We also know that as we age, naturally, both humans and dolphins have C15 levels go down independent of diet. So with aging, perhaps that might be one reason why we break down with age, is to get C15 back to, again, reverse that aging process. So our leading hypothesis is that population-wide nutritional C15 deficiencies are actually driving the increase of chronic aging-related diseases, especially among younger and younger people, right? We're seeing younger people get type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease. We're working with Dr. Jeff Schwimmer at Rady Children's Hospital. He's the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologist working on NAFLD. Jeff has been pursuing the hypothesis alongside with us for 10 years that C15 nutritional deficiencies caused NAFLD. We didn't have NAFLD until we took C15 away. Let's put it back in. So it seems like the right solution then, right, is to just let's go back to milk and start drinking that. And I do drink milk and eat butter unabashedly. But there are limitations to milk. And this may be the solution for kids. It may be that pediatricians won't tell parents of 2-year-olds to take their kids off of whole-fat milk because they need that C15. But there are limitations. The first is that when you look at whole dairy fat, it only contains 1% of C15. It contains 30% of C16, which is an even-chain pro-inflammatory saturated fat that continues to be associated with an increased risk, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease. Second, C15 levels have changed in our milk based upon what cows eat. So if cows eat corn, it has less C15 in their milk than if they're fed grass. The amount of C15 from grass actually changes based upon what type of grass they're fed. So we have less control over what cows are eating. And then the third is that C15 gets tied up in complex lipids. So when C15 comes from food, whether it's from plants or milk, it's tied up in complex triacylglycerides, which we cannot absorb. So we've got to use digestive enzymes to cleave off the free fatty acid C15 before we can absorb it and put it to work. So that is why the research and a lot of the efforts in the clinical trials have focused on pure free fatty acid C15. It's readily absorbed, it's science-backed, and we can truly understand what C15 can do, the power of it, when it is not hindered by pro-inflammatory saturated fats. We can make it free fatty, we can make it bioavailable, we can make it vegan-friendly. So that's kind of awesome, right? That all that's happened thanks to dolphins. So with all of this, what we did then is we're like, okay, we tested C15 against pure C15 against omega-3. Let's see how it does against the top, 3 of the top leading longevity molecules. And these are prescription drugs, right? So we used that same biomap test to test it against rapamycin, metformin, and acarbose. And here's what we showed. So don't get too cross-eyed, but this is the biomap profile. It's 12 different human cell systems mimicking various disease states. All these little things on the bottom are the 148 biomarkers. When you see the little letters, it means it did something significantly, statistically significantly, and dose-dependent. So this is where the 36 cellular benefits come from C15. When we look at omega-3, that's where you can see it does have benefits right on the bottom here, but it only had 10 compared to C15. And when we look at acarbose hardly had any, but it actually makes sense, right? Because acarbose doesn't work by working on our cells. It just stops the absorption of sugars. So then when we look at metformin, it gets a little bit better, right? Metformin has 17 cellular benefits, and rapamycin came in really close with 32 benefits. So when we take a step back and we now look at these longevity molecules, everything I just shared about C15, how evolution has used C15 to help mammals live longer, it all kind of makes sense, right? And so when we take a step back and we realize this kind of quirky and crazy mix of activities, anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, antioxidant, anti-cancer, and antimicrobial, right? Like if you have that in your toolbox, you're going to live healthier and you're going to live longer. We were meant to have this all along. We didn't have to go to Easter Island to find some weird bacteria that made this molecule, this complex molecule, which is wonderful and does these great things. That C15 does these same things, and it's what every mammal gets at birth.